Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington, Tacoma. I'd like to welcome everyone back to another installment of our fall seminar series, Working Together. And I am really excited about tonight's speaker who's joining us, zooming all the way in from Superior, Wisconsin. We'll be talking, he's going to be sharing her work on the intersection of settler colonialism, tribal sovereignty, and American labor history. And I think, at the risk of understatement, this is a story that has been long misunderstood. It's a story that's overwritten by narratives of American exceptionalism and notions of, progress. And I think that, recovering this history is in and of itself a radical act. It's an act that challenges some of the core principles that this nation was founded upon. And I think it's a history that demands to be acknowledged. And I just want to, speaking of acknowledgements, I think, many of you have probably noticed how we've begun incorporating land acknowledgements into most of our institutional functions. I think these are incredibly important gestures. They're signs of progress. However, they often end at just that, right? Acknowledging a history, a history that is state-sponsored theft, it's genocide, it's erasure. And I think sometimes by focusing on, the land and what happened historically, they often fail to address the continuing impact Indigenous peoples have on shaping the environments that they occupy. As well as the ongoing patterns of resistance that continue to this day, patterns that really connect the past and the present. So, while I agree that land acknowledgements certainly matter, I think, what really matters is something a little more complicated and maybe even something a little more radical, which is the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. And that's actually exactly what our speaker is here to discuss tonight, why Indigenous sovereignty matters. So Dr. Chantal Norrgard is a historian, a professor, and an author specializing in Native American and Indigenous studies at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. She's joining us tonight to discuss Seasons of Change, Labor, Treaty Rights, and Ojibwe Nationhood. It's a fantastic book. It was the winner of the Labor and Working Class History Association's David Montgomery Book Award back in 2014. Which is given to the best book in the topic of American labor and working class history. I could not agree with the judges more on that, and I'd please encourage everyone to join me in welcoming Dr. Chantal Norrgard to the Labor Solidarity Project. Thanks so much for being part of this series. Just really excited to provide a platform for your work, which I think again is incredibly important. We've got some questions that have been submitted ahead of time by students. But I'd also like to encourage people who are in the audience, who may not also be taking the class, to contribute questions on the discussion board. We're going to have a short presentation. This is going to be a little different than the typical LSP event. We're going to do a shorter presentation and then just kind of, more of a free-flowing conversation. So again, Chantal, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here and to have such a great turnout for this talk. I want to say Bonjour, Ani, Chantal Norrgard, Indigenous, Duluth, Minnesota, or Oningami Sing in Dojiba. And I do want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional treaty reserve territories, ceded territories of the Lake Superior Ojibwe people. And I want to add to that, that this compels me as a scholar and educator to take on the responsibility of educating people about Indigenous histories and also the impacts of colonialism and recognizing those in the places that we live and teach. So thank you very much for having me. I think I'll just start off by talking a little bit about myself and how I came to this project, and then where I went with it. And then I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions as well. There's some fantastic questions that were submitted ahead of time. So I grew up in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, and I'm actually now teaching in the same area that I grew up in. And both my parents worked for tribal communities in this area. So my dad worked for the Fond du Lac Band of Ojibwe, and my mom worked for public television, working on Indigenous content with the communities here. And so as a child, I was exposed to Indigenous history early on. I come from a settler background, and I certainly am careful not to speak for Indigenous people, but I'm very much interested in this history. And I learned a lot about this history at a pretty young age, just getting to know community members, specifically hearing a lot of stories from elders talking about their lives. I grew up during a period of treaty rights conflicts. So I think many of you in the Pacific Northwest are very much familiar with some of these conflicts as well, around fishing rights in particular, but I think also macaw whaling was an issue that was maybe a little bit more recent. In Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, Ojibwe people reserved the rights to hunt, fish, and gather in 19th century treaties with the United States. And we're in the early 20th century until about the 1970s, 1980s, really hindered by the states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan in exercising those rights. And when those rights were recognized by what's called the Voigt decision in the late 80s, there was a lot of backlash over the ability to practice treaty rights, and a lot of racism on the part of non-Indigenous people. And so that was something that happened while I was growing up, and something that I was exposed to some extent. And so I was very much interested in exploring the roots of these issues in my own work, because the central thing that I learned through most of my life, and then going into grad school at the University of Minnesota in history, was the centrality of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. Taking courses in American Indian Studies, which were again really key to what I was doing, that was what was emphasized every time when we talk about Ojibwe history: treaty rights and sovereignty. And so I was very much interested in talking about that. And I wanted to think about it as a historian. And so started to go to different local archives. I'm very much interested in local history because, again, it kind of relates to my own experiences and what I'd heard from Ojibwe history, and was doing an internship as a graduate student with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission in northern Wisconsin, which is an organization that focuses on the regulation of hunting, fishing, and gathering, and basically the enactment of Ojibwe treaty rights for a number of bands in this area. And at the same time, while I was doing this internship, I was also kind of digging around in local archives, and I came across this collection that was called the Chippewa Indian Historical Project. And it was on microfilm. It was in the local historical society branch of the Wisconsin Historical Society in Ashland, Wisconsin. And I started to dig, and there were all of these essays. And at first I thought, oh, these are from the 1930s. They're just describing hunting, fishing, and gathering. But as I thought about this more, and as I talked to my advisor about this collection, which was over 300 essays written by Ojibwe people during the 30s as part of the WPA, I started to realize that, this is really about labor. And a lot of their rights are really about their livelihoods. So hunting, fishing, and gathering, and also the things that they did to survive after the treaties were negotiated and they were relocated to these tiny reservations. So I began to see this story that was about livelihoods, but at the same time, a lot of the literature that I was reading in labor studies and labor history might talk about Indigenous culture and how Indigenous people had agency through their livelihoods, but really didn't connect it much to their actual sovereignty, to their actual political rights, and their status as nations within the United States. And so I really wanted to explain that dynamic, and I wanted to talk about how that really constituted a form of labor and how it shaped Indigenous experiences so they could do something like work in the lumber industry alongside non-Indigenous people doing some of the same labor. But because of colonialism and the dispossession of land and the fact that they were working in their own ceded territory, it could mean something vastly different to them than it could mean to the person working beside them on the job. And so that was really what I wanted to talk about and to explain, to really insert tribal sovereignty and their political autonomy and their rights into the picture of labor, and to create a way to talk about that, because it's something that I still see as being quite absent. And there are many aspects of labor that are still very much colonial, even though there have been new ways to describe different dynamics of work, such as race, gender, class. We still haven't really talked much about settler colonialism and the political rights of Indigenous people. So my work really prioritizes that and really focuses on that as something that I learned from my work with Ojibwe communities.
I agree. It is one of the reasons I was really attracted to this book is because I feel like it it's one of it's a very short shelf in terms of labor studies work that looks at Indigenous labor. And I mean, it seems like just kind of a gross oversight, but I think it's that absence might be explained by precisely that tension you note. The idea of you know uh, uh, natives working within their own ancestral lands, right? Sort of working within the context of settler colonialism, while also being sort of bound by the United States. I didn't know the origin story of the work. That's really exciting. I feel like it's a glowing endorsement for
Oh, thanks.
maybe like the Tacoma Historical Society here locally. Like you never know what these local historical societies might hold on to, and they're just treasure troves of documents that maybe a university library might not see the immediate value of. Um, so that's really interesting. I had a question. I mean, if we could kind of go back even further and just kind of talk about what Ojibwe culture and I guess maybe even labor looked like pre-contact. You mentioned in your intro this concept of the good life, and I was kind of thinking about that vis-a-vis, what the what the mandates of capitalism installed post-contact. So can you take us back before contact?
Sure. And it's very complicated. I mean, I know that oftentimes we tend to think of before contact as a really simple history to describe. But I think this also relates to, in my intro to my book, I talk about the report done by Berger on just the definition of subsistence and what that might mean for Indigenous people. And it's very complex. It's multi-layered. It encompasses so many different aspects of life. So it's hard for me to do it justice. And even describing it in English, I'm missing so many things, because if you think about Indigenous languages, and if anybody knows anything about, for example, the Ojibwe language, most of it is verbs. So most of it actually describes, when you describe a word, you're actually describing doing something. So words for subsistence are even really complex. And it's something that we miss, not knowing these languages as well. I think the most important thing that I'd say about Ojibwe labor pre-contact is that it was still really centered on this seasonal round. This round of subsistence that's cyclical, that's governed by the land in which I'm living on, and that environment. So hunting in the fall and many times of the year, fishing in waterways, hunting, fishing, gathering. Gathering entails a lot of different things. So everything from harvesting maple sugar in the spring to harvesting wild rice in the fall, which is an incredibly important part of Ojibwe identity. It's a part of their explanation for how they came to the Great Lakes. They followed the food that grows on water. And just all of the myriad of wild plants and medicines that would be gathering. I mean, gathering is kind of a misnomer in itself. And then that also entails the relationship to the land, to the plants and animals that inhabit the land, to the water, to the sky. All of those things are animate. They have spirits. They are beings that exist alongside you. And so the concept of labor, the concept of surviving or subsisting, for a lack of a better term, really also entails specific relationships with all of these different plants and animals. And it's a reciprocal relationship. So when you take something, one of the things that I've learned about it is that you're saying to that animal or that plant, really, I'm helpless. I need your help. I can't survive without your help. And so I'm going to give you this gift, this small, maybe it's tobacco or something to show my appreciation, to show that I'm sincere, to show that I recognize you. And it's a kind of reciprocity. And so gift giving is very important and was very important in that sense. And then it's just sort of the way that you relate to those things. So there are many stories about overhunting, overfishing, and what happens as a consequence of that, or not gifting, not following Bimadi Ziwin or the good life. So I hope I'm explaining that. Again, it's incredibly complex, and I'm really just touching the tip of the iceberg in various examples. But it's really a way of living life on the land and relating to one another and relating to the plants and animals and the other beings around you. And labor fits into that.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real element of conservation there too. And I think you see it, and your book does a good job of talking about sort of, just the absolute sort of ecological and environmental decimation of the region, within a very short period of time. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that, those sort of like the first waves of settler colonialism and how they sort of disrupted that cycle of the good life, and maybe kind of, introduced a much more opportunistic way of looking at kind of land and resources?
Yeah, I would say that the first major introduction to that was definitely the fur trade, in the sense that you still have that reciprocity going on, that doesn't disappear, but the focus on a single thing, which is really to harvest, to trap beaver, and to get beaver pelts and to trade for beaver pelts, is really the first major disruption in Ojibwe and other Indigenous lifeways in the Great Lakes, in the sense that it really shifts their economy to focus on this trade, and to focus on specific animals that are then hunted or trapped for the trade. And that's kind of the first transition in their economy, but that doesn't necessarily mean the dispossession of land. And often when they were first entering into treaty negotiations, especially with the United States, they really thought, and they understood it kind of in the same way that they had approached other non-Indigenous people, which is that they weren't necessarily interested in acquiring taking away land here. Land here is not very good for farming. And they didn't really anticipate the major lumber boom that there would be. So really what they were thinking of in the treaty was more so a kind of usufructory relationship where, okay, we can co-use this land. That doesn't mean you're going to assert power over me or necessarily take away these lands from me. And it's really not until the mid 19th century that they start to understand that this is more so about the dispossession of lands and the imposition of power. And so the reservation of treaty rights is a way of still retaining some access to those lands. And that's really a survival strategy on their part.
Well, yeah, and it seems like they would have, yeah, the economy would have developed alongside patterns of migration, right? They'd need sort of an outlet for those, the timber to be consumed, right? So it
Right.
must have, kind of changed the way that the colonial enterprise kind of looked at the landscape, right?
And
Um,
there were certainly traders who were interested in harvesting timber on kind of a small scale, but again, it was just, maybe a tiny mill on a river and not like an entire swath of millions of acres of land.
Nice. Well, I want to acknowledge Shelby Cross, former student, welcome, who's got a question about the WPA, but I feel like we're so far away from there, at least chronologically. So we're working our way up to the WPA, but before we got there, I wanted to ask about those initial treaties, how they kind of transform that relationship between the indigenous populations and settlers, but also between kind of the way indigenous peoples came to see their labor.
I think that really um, this happens more and more so with a reservation economy. So when the treaties in 1854, specifically the 1854 treaty, focuses on relocating Anishinaabe people to reservations, and also the restriction of their ability to move on and off reservation, and many policies such as assimilation that are really about trying to change their life ways so that they're more like non-Indigenous people. I think that that's really when the transition starts. I wouldn't say that they necessarily approach the way that they see these economies in the same way that Europeans do, though they make a living through them. I would say that they think of this as the best choice possible in a very small gamut of choices, and ways to adapt some of their traditions and their traditional livelihoods so that they'll survive. So, for example, the chapter on how berrying, picking berries of various kinds, gets transformed to growing berries and fruit, or harvesting berries as a part of labor is, I think, one example of that, where berrying is an important part of gathering, but it's transformed in a way that it will survive so that they're not losing that meaning. And in some ways, it's disguised from people like Indian agents who really want to see them transforming their ways of life and are really putting pressure on them to do that. Now, things like the lumber industry are a little bit harder to make arguments about because that's such a clearly destructive thing when it comes to their environment and their lands and their values. It's something that really runs against that. And so again, I would argue that it's probably the best choice possible, as they see it during a time when they have very few choices.
Nice. I definitely want to talk about logging more because I feel like some of the more interesting characters emerge in your book during those chapters. But before we get there, I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about, the reservation system, maybe the Dawes Act, as these are policies that sort of policed mobility, but they also worked to kind of change the way that people saw themselves, and that that settlers saw indigenous peoples. Um, so I'm kind of curious to know, like, what do you think the kind of non-material consequences of those laws were? Like, you talk a little bit about this, the logic of elimination, and I'd just
Right.
like to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I think um, just in terms of, um, now let me think. Non-material is hard to describe, but I think that um, one of the things that happens quite early on as a result of allotment is that they lose so much land. So we're talking about around 99% of their lands are gone, especially on smaller reservations like Red Cliff Reservation, which I talk about in the book. Um, the thing that really continues to allow people to continue their traditions and to continue with their livelihoods is this rights to hunt, fish, and gather in ceded territory. Um, and so even if you've lost most of your reservation lands, you can still technically hunt, fish, and gather in ceded territory. And this is a really big part of Ojibwe assertions of their identity and their political rights, these rights to hunt, fish, and gather in ceded territory. And I think that struggle to do that really becomes a key part of their identity. The other important part of this is mobility and movement and retaining connections with communities and families who are maybe not located in the exact same area as you. Traditional Ojibwe organization or political organization and social organization is based on a clan system that's patrilineal. And so people were organized around this clan system and kinship, and you would go to other places where there were members of the same clan, and you would have an affiliation with them. So kinship is incredibly important, and movement places where there are other Ojibwe people where you can retain a sense of community is important. And I think that becomes increasingly important when they lose most of their lands. And then, of course, in some cases, working in some forms of labor. So Ojibwe lumberjacks, for example, retaining some sense of identity either by working together in families. So maybe a son, some uncles, cousins, they might all work together in the same lumber camp. Or even some of these visible, tangible signs of indigeneity. So when I talk about wearing certain things on their clothing as lumberjacks, just to indicate a sense of identity still, or who we are.
Yeah, I think that the chapter on the logging industry is just, it's fascinating because it's, generally, if I teach labor studies out here, and we look at sort of the timber industry, that, that was some of the most exploitative work in the Pacific
Mhm.
Northwest, right? It was sort of the bottom of the bottom. But you, in those logging camps, you actually managed to find, I think, instances of, identity reclamation, cultural exchange, and I think what I was really excited about was the kind of the way you looked at celebrity, right? The sort of the way that certain indigenous timber workers were able to kind of like compete in the, you know, well, can you talk a little bit about that? The kind of the log rolling and
Yeah, so this is something I don't think I would have ever picked up on had I not read through some of these WPA documents and also just looked at local newspapers from the time. And these well-known log rollers kept standing out in some of these newspapers, in some of the WPA accounts, and just local histories. I really got this sense that they had these contests, as a lot of lumber companies actually sponsored or supported these types of occupational contests as a way of promoting their industries and also maybe getting workers to improve their skills. But I didn't know how central Ojibwe identity really was to this. And there are other occupations as well where I think it's in some ways it's stereotypical. So it can be a bit problematic in the sense that, the agility of Ojibwe log burlers is emphasized, or like there are some stereotypical characteristics that are associated with them. But at the same time, I think this is a way to achieve some fame or some recognition for a person's work that they might not necessarily receive. And so I think there's a sense of pride in that. The other places where you see examples of that around here are Ojibwe mail carriers. So there's the John Bear Grease sled dog race, which we still have here. And it's named after an Ojibwe mail carrier who was, again, quite famous for his ability to carry mail under all these really difficult conditions. So there are a number of people like that in Ojibwe history who are known for their work, and kind of heroicized and in some ways stereotyped. And I think the other example is definitely the Ojibwe guides. So the guide who worked for Calvin Coolidge and a number of others who also kind of achieved some local fame and some press for their work.
I thought we were going to save that anecdote for later, but since you brought
Sorry.
it up, can you share the Calvin Coolidge hunting trip to the Great North story?
Yes, so it's really well known, especially in Superior, because Superior and the area around it was known as the summer White House for Calvin Coolidge. And there are a lot of photographs of him fishing and catching fish. But what's not really recognized is the guide who was behind him, who was an Ojibwe man who served in World War I and then came back and worked as a fishing guide on the Brule River. And this labor was so extensive to the extent that they would often, guide the person's pole in the river to where the fish was, and then they would let the person, like Calvin Coolidge, pull it out. So they actually did most of the work in this guiding, and they're stereotyped quite a bit. I mean, there are newspaper articles on Calvin Coolidge's Indian guide and Calvin Coolidge possibly getting an Indigenous name, although that seems like something that maybe the newspapers invented as a great story. A lot of this kind of relates to ideas about playing Indian as well, that Philip Deloria has talked about. So I think a lot of these wealthy sportsmen who come up to northern Minnesota and Wisconsin who want to, are up here to fish or to hunt, they like to appropriate some aspects of Indigenous culture. So they have their own clubs. It's kind of like the Boy Scouts, where they have like different degrees, and they'll appropriate Indigenous names or ceremonies as part of this activity. And it's really quite offensive, looking at it through my eyes, of course. But at the time, there's this really interesting way in which hiring an Indigenous guide is kind of like an authentic experience. And I think a lot of Indigenous people take advantage of this because, again, it's a way of earning a livelihood in the midst of a lot of limited chances to work. And we have to remember that they're living in poverty at this time. So it's really important to be able to find work, and this is kind of a niche that they can do it in.
Yeah, and it kind of signals that transition that your book teases out between, you know, looking at the land as a purely extractive experiment within capitalism to this sort of second period with the emergence of, as we call them out here in the Pacific Northwest, the sporties, right? The sportsmen come in, and all of a sudden this, what was initially kind of an exclusively economic relationship to the land gets looped in with, conceptions of masculinity, which I think
Mhm.
kind of connects back to your chapter on the timber industry. Because we're moving away from the early history, I did want to touch on this question that popped up in the chat, and encourage everybody else who's in the audience to pose questions. This is really interesting. So you mentioned that the Ojibwe's language was composed mostly of verbs. Uh, do you think that had an impact on their ability to understand treaties?
Well, that is an interesting question. I think more so when we think about their concepts of land, many concepts in English didn't necessarily translate. So, for example, there really wasn't a word for ceding land over to somebody where they would gain title and ownership to it, and you didn't have it anymore. There was a concept of shared land use, so co-sharing, co-using land. Um, there were treaties in Canada, in fact, that were treaties between Indigenous people, so Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people and Anishinaabe Ojibwe people. There's one called the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and that treaty is really all about co-management, co-use of land, not necessarily infringing on one another's power, but being able to use the land together and having a responsibility to that. So the concept of land cession, I think, is the biggest one that you can't really translate that into the Ojibwe Anishinaabe language. And I think that's where the US really takes advantage of things. So that's a really key one. And I think now, in terms of just interpreting treaty rights, treaties are to be interpreted as Indigenous people would have understand them. So we actually have to do a lot of research into Ojibwe language to understand some of the terms of the treaties and how Ojibwe people at the time understood them. And this has come up certainly in some of these court cases in the 1980s and 1990s, where there was a real push to recognize these, to stop state infringement and to recognize these rights.
It is really interesting how sort of the logic and the structure of a language can really kind of reflect how people come to see their relationships to each other, relationships to land. I'm thinking of indigenous peoples in Hawaii. I think Trask writes that they didn't really have a personal possessive pronoun, right? So it's like their idea to conceive of themselves as sort of owning something exclusively, it just didn't exist. And I think it's for a similar logic to that idea of the seasonal round, right? There's sort of a commonwealth, and things are sort of owned, in concert with others. And as long as everybody's sort of actively practicing good stewardship, like there's sort of plenty to go around. We have a question here on history and Thanksgiving. It is, seasonally appropriate. I'm wondering if there is, so this is Shelby again. Let me see. So this is while we're still on early history. Any thoughts in regards to Thanksgiving? With that coming up, I was wondering if there's an Ojibwe knowledge history to share. I don't know how you might want to take that one on.
I'm not sure what to say about that, because Thanksgiving is what it is, and it actually relates to a very particular history on the East Coast, and a particular interpretation of that history. I'm not sure, is the question about what can people do as an alternative to Thanksgiving, or I'm
I'm not
trying to
sure, but
find the meaning in that.
I'll invite Shelby to clarify. I did want to talk. We got a question about recent wins for Ojibwe sovereignty in recent years. I definitely want to come. I want to come to the end, at least to the talking about
Sure.
present day relationships as we wrap. But before we get there, if we can take sort of a circuitous route, I wanted to talk about tourism and kind of the culture industry. And you sort of touched on this a little bit already, but I think one of the things, again, that I found really interesting about your book is it kind of explores that paradox that resides at the heart of like quote unquote native tourism, right?
Hmm.
This can be some of the most exploitative, stereotypical performance work out there. Or it can actually be really empowering, which I mean, you sort of look at that from, I think the popular way of looking at it is exclusively from a lens of exploitation. But you managed to find, I think, instances of like, community identity reclamation. So I'm kind of curious to know based on your research, what do you think kind of the relationship between that native tourism that you were looking at and this larger question of Ojibwe sovereignty was?
I think that it's really about, so for one, I think that the tourist industry and this shift, this real focus on the actual restriction of hunting and fishing. Before that, you have some focus on that, and certainly Indian agents are not pleased with people who are going to hunt, or even selling game to make a living. It's something that's definitely frowned upon. But you really don't have that kind of state focused restriction until, I mean, it's really in its heyday in the early 20th century. And that really is a result of this new focus on conservation and the tourist industry and sports people coming in and really being interested in conserving resources. And Indigenous people become a kind of scapegoat for that, even though we've had this big lumber industry and fishing industry that have clearly been the reason why fish are depleted, why the conditions are the way that they are. The focus is on Indigenous people because it's a way of scapegoating. It's a way of discriminating based on race, and it's a kind of, it's tourist colonialism is what I call it in the chapter. Interestingly enough, I think that this is really the push for a lot of Ojibwe people who have lived with this and seen their family members struggle with this, to really start to assert their rights to hunt, fish, and gather, and their rights to a livelihood. So I think that ironically, as this becomes, or maybe not ironically, as this becomes more restricted, it really provides the impetus and the shift to start focusing on tribal sovereignty and on hunting, fishing, and gathering rights, because they're so restricted and threatened as a result of tourism and as a result of a particular kind of view of the landscape or the wilderness that's being privileged in opposition to Indigenous people.
And could you maybe talk a little bit more about the, beyond sort of guide work, the type of kind of, just the different ways that Indigenous people sort of engaged in that tourism industry? I just think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, so everything from selling things like birch bark baskets on the roadside to performing in events like the Apostle Indian Island Apostle Island Indian pageant, which actually Katie Phillips has just written about in her work, and she's a scholar from Redcliffe. All sorts of kind of performative things that relate to Indigenous identity, I would say, was a really key part of this tourist industry. I'm trying to remember other examples. There are lots of smaller specific ones.
Yeah, I thought the chapter really did a great job of just sort of opening up, you know, so often we sort of look at it from the gaze of the tourist, right? And we fail to see sort of the agency of the object of the gaze, right? And I think, especially during a period of time where this logic of the logic of elimination is actively trying to suppress any sign of indigenous culture. They're able to find in their sort of tourist performance a way of kind of keeping that keeping those embers alive and passing those traditions down. It's a weird, like, sort of kind of a soft spot, right? There's like an area where they're actually allowed to sort of practice these performances and rituals and kind of keep that culture alive. It's just really interesting.
Right. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of that when you mentioned Audra Simpson's notion of everyday nationalism, right? It's these sort of little daily acts that allow sort of people to imagine themselves as part of a cohesive nation.
Yeah, and so much of this, I mean, that was such a useful concept to me. She's an anthropologist. She's Mohawk, and I believe she's still at Columbia. But she's done a lot of work, at least in this case, on the daily interactions and just the things that people do and how it relates to their identity as members of Indigenous nations. And so I saw a lot of this just in terms of the kinds of just what did it mean to be doing a livelihood on a daily basis, some of which were associated with treaty rights. What was the meaning that Ojibwe people gave to it? And that's not to say that every single thing had meaning. I'm not trying to over romanticize this or emphasize this, but definitely certain things did. And they definitely related to identity as an Ojibwe Anishinaabe person, and they related to sovereignty. And so I think that concept of some of these everyday actions and how they might amount to that was really helpful for me to think through what the meaning of Indigenous labor was and is for Ojibwe people.
Yeah, I think that's a needle you managed to thread in this book. The kind of the celebration of Indigenous resistance through labor, without making it sound like everything was fantastic. And I think maybe thinking about that the story connected to the murder of Joe White might be an interesting way of kind of like showing the audience kind of the full picture here, that it wasn't all resistance and cultural reclamation.
No, and Joe White's story is it really resonates with some of the events that have been happening recently. I mean, he was basically these two conservation officers wanted to arrest him for hunting out of season, and this is an Ojibwe leader from the Lukudere Reservation. And this was in the 1880s, I think. I can't remember the exact date. But they came to the lumber camp that he was working in, and they tried to arrest him, and he resisted. And then he tried to flee, and they shot and killed him. And it became an important local murder trial. It was an all-white jury, and the two conservation officers, basically walked away from the situation. And I think this is an example of the kind of heightened tensions that you actually see around treaty rights. And yeah, I think we saw it in the 1970s and 80s around white backlash and racism on boat landings when Ojibwe people were also spearfishing, people throwing rocks, people shooting off bottle rockets, people shooting off guns, mobs of people standing there harassing people for exercising their treaty rights. And this is kind of ongoing. So we continue to have reports of this happening every year on some lake in Wisconsin or Minnesota. So it hasn't necessarily gone away, but it shows, I think, how important this was to Ojibwe people, that they continued, even though in some cases their lives were in danger. And B, the amount of resistance to it on the part of non-Indigenous people. So it really was and is a political struggle that's an ongoing thing.
Well, and that's one that I mean is very local here in Tacoma. I mean, I feel like so many of the things you described, even the fact that the uh, the decision that sort of defined the redefinition of the treaties or the reinstatement of the treaties was it the Voigt decision
Yeah.
in and out here it was the Bolt decision. Even the judge's names sound similar. Like it was just kind of eerie connections between the two histories. Yeah, and I mean the similarity of someone shooting somebody in the back in an act of self-defense and then walking, is just a great example of history, maybe not repeating, but certainly rhyming over time.
It certainly sounds similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, could you maybe could we talk a little bit about more recent history and sort of
Sure.
how things have evolved over the last maybe 50 years or so? I think you conclude the book with an example, and I've got to apologize. I've actually never been to Wisconsin. So when you mentioned Grand Portage National Monument Heritage
Yeah.
Center and the Frog Bay Tribal Nation Park as kind of exciting examples of how indigenous communities can kind of enter into relationships with federal government and local organizations. Um, can you explain what those places are to me and maybe to everybody in
Sure.
the audience? And then B, kind of just tell us a little bit more about kind of how you see this relationship between sovereign nations evolving moving forward.
Sure, and I will mention one other example that I think is fantastic. So I'll talk about that too. So the Grand Portage National Monument is actually in Minnesota. It's actually way far up on the northern part of the state, the very top corner on Lake Superior, right by Canada, actually. And it's the site of an old fur trading post, a very big one. And it has a long history with the Ojibwe community there, and some of it's kind of fraught. So in the 1930s, again, as part of, I think, the CCC in this case, they hired Ojibwe people from Grand Portage to do archaeological excavations of the fur posts, which is really on their lands. And this was sponsored by the State Historical Society. And then eventually it became a national monument. And there was some conflict over the lands and also who had control over that history. And I think now the situation has been worked out so that really Grand Portage is an important site for Ojibwe people as well. And I think it's an important place where Ojibwe people in particular can interpret their history. It's also the place where they have things like rendezvous days, which is a bit about the fur trade, but it's also about the community coming together and just celebrating at that time of year. So it's very much an Indigenous place. And I think that that's very important. It kind of relates to land back movements, but in this case, it's a really tiny site in terms of the landmass. So it's more so about, I'd say, kind of history back in a way, and having some say over how that history is interpreted. The other example is Frog Bay Tribal national, I think it's a tribal national park. I'm trying to remember the exact name of it now because it's changed. But that is the first tribal park that's managed exclusively by the Red Cliff Band. And it has a kind of national status as that. So that being able to have control over a kind of national park run by a tribal nation, I think is incredibly groundbreaking. And I think that this is an example, even though, again, it's not a huge piece of land, of returning something to Anishinaabe people, Ojibwe people, and them having control over their own history, over their own land in a way that's really significant. The last example that I wanted to just briefly mention, I think I mentioned in the book, and I certainly did a lot of work with them and continue to do academic service learning projects with my students and this organization, is the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which represents 11 Ojibwe bands in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And basically is the organization or entity that is in charge of negotiating and working with the state and the federal government around treaty rights and around conservation and the co-management of resources. They came out of treaty rights struggles. They were an organization specifically designed by Ojibwe bands to do this, so that they could negotiate, for example, with the state of Wisconsin and Minnesota, Michigan as well. But they also, one really important aspect is that they do a lot of studies as well on the environment. So they have a lot of useful information to everyone in the state, to non-Indigenous people as well. And they have just this incredible educational programming to really teach people about treaty rights. What do they mean? Why are they significant? How are they important to Ojibwe culture? And they, for example, have a free quarterly newspaper that they send out to all sorts of people all over the state of Wisconsin. So they've done just tremendous work in terms of educating people about sovereignty, and also just in terms of the practice of sovereignty, especially as it relates to the environment and now all the environmental shifts that we're seeing as well.
That is really impressive, and I feel like it speaks to the degree to which this is work, right? It is as I mentioned in my opening, land acknowledgements are a beginning, but I mean it's doing the work of actually recognizing sovereignty, and I like that idea of history back, right? Like part of that work is recuperating and recovering these histories. And that's why I think, what you do, like in my opinion, is an incredibly radical form of scholarship. And I think that, we need more people, hitting up those local historical archives and finding these records because they're out there, and kind of recentering, the experience of, and not just Indigenous people, but all marginalized people from a history that they have been, just written out of. So again, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your work, for zooming in tonight and sharing your expertise with us. And yeah, this has been really interesting, and I hope everybody gets a chance to check out Chantal's book, Seasons of Change. Oh, I see people are frantically adding questions to the discussion board. I mentioned earlier we were going to wrap a little early tonight because Chantal is joining us from Wisconsin, and it's already 2 hours later there.
I can take a few extra, maybe an extra 5 minutes if
Okay,
there are any
sure.
questions.
Yeah.
Or a couple of extra minutes.
Let's see.
I don't know if there's one that's sticking out. I see a lot of things in the chat.
I'm gonna have to speed read here.
I'll try to look as well. Oh wow, there's a lot of great questions. What an impressive audience.
Yeah, we have the best students.
Want to come over to Wisconsin?
I see someone just shaking his head.
No, he doesn't. He heard about Aaron Rodgers and he said no. Yeah, exactly.
Sharon's got one about the extraction industries and subject, just a question about whether or not they're subject land conflicts regarding pipelines, oil industries, or running pipelines through the state or indigenous lands.
Oh yes, yeah, and we've been really at the center of it this past summer. So um, there have been a tremendous amount of conflicts, and one of the things that I find irritating as a labor historian is that often the media um, pits workers against indigenous people as if indigenous people are the destroyers of jobs because of their focus on the environment. Um, and I think that's really problematic given the history that I've just discussed. There, I want to recommend, because my book doesn't cover this, that there is an excellent book from a person who's a scholar in your area named Zoltan Grossman. So I don't know if you've heard of him, but he actually writes about these conflicts over the environment and how indigenous people and actually environmentalists are forming alliances together because tribal sovereignty is so important in terms of asserting environmental rights as well. So I think I've seen a lot of that happening in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin around pipelines and around mining, which has really been front and center for us.
Sorry, I'm just making a note on the recommendation. That sounds like a book I need to read.
He's actually, I think he's teaches at Evergreen State, I want to say. So he's
Oh my
actually
God.
in your area.
Okay. Excellent. We did have a question about modern concepts of race. This is a huge question. The relationship between Native American sovereignty and modern conceptions of race. I don't know if we want to take that one on at this hour.
Well, that's a long one. I would say, I would say that race is certainly an important dynamic in this, but I think the focus on equity and equality, those can be sometimes problematic when we're talking about tribal sovereignty because and again, I'm generalizing quite a bit. This looks very different for different people, but I would say that the idea of inclusion, or that everybody is sort of on, and again, I'm generalizing, but on equal terms, is something that for a lot of indigenous people, I think looks very colonial because it looks a lot like assimilation, even though it may not, that's not the intent at all. I think a lot of, and I don't want to speak for indigenous people, but I think a lot of the focus would be on, hey, we have tribal sovereignty, we're indigenous people, and yes, we've been affected by racism, but the most important thing is recognizing that we are members of nations within the United States, and we have a distinct set of political rights that need to be respected.
Exactly. And I think the book does a really good job of kind of tracing out various instances of racialization within, not only, local indigenous people, but also, various groups of European migrants. And I thought that was kind of one of the interesting things. I know that the similar situation here in Washington State, Norwegians, Scandinavians, like these were people who were, classified as, a racialized group, right? And
Mhm.
sort of, in those timber camps, there was a kind of solidarity that I feel like, to 21st century conceptions of race, like doesn't really make much sense on paper, but was
Mhm.
nevertheless very real in that moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think that's why, foregrounding indigenous sovereignty over and above all else is, kind of the way you need to look at it.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap.
All right.
This was fantastic. I'm so glad we got a great turnout tonight. Thank you so much for joining us again. Thank you, everybody in the studio audience, for joining us for this event. This was really great. This was I think I mentioned when we talked over the summer when I was putting together the lineup. This was like the first book. I was like, I gotta. It was like I've
Oh,
been wanting to read this book and I wanted to talk to you, and you've just been super generous in terms of your time. And yeah, I can't wait to see. Keep me posted on your work as it develops.
absolutely. And thank you so much for having me and for these wonderful questions. It's a privilege to join you and to be chosen to do this. So this is such a wonderful thing that you're doing. I really appreciate it.